Her Fake Christmas Date, by Victorine Lieske. Chapter 1. Jennifer tugged on her suitcase, trying to get it out of her trunk while the cold air stung her cheeks. Why had she stuffed so many clothes in? It felt like it weighed a zillion pounds. Can a suitcase gain weight as you drive? Jennifer wasn't sure, but the thing wasn't going to budge. In frustration, she let out a grunt and slapped it. Unfortunately, the motion made her slip on the icy street and she landed on her butt. Great. She tried to get up but her boot slipped uselessly on the ice and she was back on her behind, the cold seeping through her jeans. A hand extended down. You okay? Jennifer looked up and of course it was a handsome man. She would embarrass herself in front of the only hot guy she'd ever seen in her mother's neighborhood. Her heartbeat picked up as she allowed him to help her to her feet. Yeah, thanks. Need some help? She smiled and pointed to her suitcase, suddenly feeling silly. I can't lift it. He leaned down and grabbed the handle, easily pulling it out. No problem. I've got it. Something about the way he said it sounded familiar to her, and she squinted at him. He kind of looked like, no. Could it really be Shane? He stared at her. Yeah, holy cow, I didn't recognize you. He'd changed so much since the last time she'd seen him. He looked older. More mature. Okay, she had to admit it. He was handsome. And buff. What had he been doing since she'd left? Lifting tree trunks for a living? And did it suddenly get hot out here? She fanned her face. Shane gave her that crooked smile she was so familiar with. Really? Well, you've changed so much. Jennifer waved her hand over him, unsure of what word would be appropriate. When too much time had passed, she just blurted out the first word that popped into her head. Hot. No. That wasn't what she wanted to say. I mean, grown up. Heat rushed to her face and she turned from him for fear he would see her blush. He just chuckled. I'll carry this up to the house for you. He motioned toward her mother's home. Thank you. She probably would have ended up falling on her, but again had she tried to the thing up the sidewalk. She stared at his thick arms. Why aren't you wearing a coat? I saw you slip and I came out to help. Shane closed her trunk and started up the walkway, slowing when she didn't join him right away. How long are you visiting? Jennifer rushed to catch up. 10 days. 10 long days. She loved her mother, but she wasn't looking forward to the barrage of questions she was sure to hit her with. Are you dating anyone? Why not? Don't you think it's been long enough? When are you going to get back on the saddle? She cringed. Shane nodded and opened the gate and held it for her. Thanks, she said as she passed through. It will be good to catch up. It's been a while since I've seen my mother. 5 years, he said under his breath. She snapped her gaze up at him. How did you know that? He shrugged, his face passive. I live next door. She peered over at the 2-story tutor that had been sitting next door since she could remember. Shane had always lived there, except for a semester of college before his mother's stroke. After that he'd quit school to take care of her. How's your mom doing? She has good days and bad days. Jennifer followed him up the porch steps. It was nice talking to Shane. She hadn't really talked with him since they'd been friends in high school. Actually, it was probably more like middle school. They drifted apart during high school. He stopped and set her suitcase down. She looked up at him, her heart suddenly beating in her ears. We should catch up sometime. He gazed at her a moment before answering. Sure. Sounds good. He turned and before she knew it he was halfway down the walkway. Bye, she called, suddenly wishing he'd stayed to talk. He gave her a half wave before he walked to his home and disappeared inside. Jennifer stood on her porch a second looking at the neighbor's house. Maybe she would go talk to Shane. Tomorrow. Today she had to face her mother and her questions. She took in a deep breath, then pushed open the door. Mom. I'm here. Chapter 2. Jennifer held her breath while her mother, Mary Catherine, gave her that searching look. She knew what was coming. It hadn't taken long either. She'd just hung her coat up. Christmas music played on the radio in the kitchen while she waited for it. You dating anyone? And there it was. Jennifer let out her breath in a whoosh. Mom. Her mother frowned. I'm sorry, dear. I don't mean to pry. I just want you to be happy. I am happy. The words were out before Jennifer could think about them. Was it true? Was she happy? She'd finally gotten over Mark leaving her at the altar. At least, she thought she was over that. It was horrible and embarrassing, but after all the tears and tubs of ice cream, she had to admit to herself that she'd been more in love with the idea of being in love than with Mark. It was awful getting left at the altar, but he may have done her a favor. Her mother scrutinized her. Are you? Yes. Okay, maybe that was a stretch. She worked pretty much all the time. Being the assistant to the assistant of a top executive at an ad agency in New York had her running all over the place. Pretty much taking lunch orders and getting coffee, but still. It did keep her mind off of her empty apartment, at least until she went home and sat there, alone. Okay. That's all that matters. Her mother fussed with her hair, her eyes darting around the room. Why did she look guilty? What is it, Mom? Nothing. I invited someone over for dinner. That's all. What? Who? Jennifer plopped down on the sofa. Marian's son. You remember him, don't you? She fingered her necklace, a surefire sign that she was up to no good. Jerry? Mom. He smells like fish. He has a condition. Be nice to him. The last thing Jennifer wanted to do was sit through dinner with Jerry Hansen making eyes at her. There was a reason he was still single. He creeped everyone out. I can't make it to dinner. The words were out before Jennifer could censor them. Why not? I have. Shoot. What could she say that would make her mother back off? A date. With who? You just got here. Jennifer nodded, her mind racing. She had to come up with something good. And then it hit her. The perfect alibi. Shane. From next door. Shane? Yes. He helped me bring my suitcase up. And that's when he asked me out. Her gaze landed on the tiny manger scene hanging from her mother's Christmas tree, and guilt wormed its way into her chest. She'd have to ask for forgiveness later for the lie. Her mother's face brightened. He did? Well, isn't that lovely? You know, I've always thought he was a nice young man. Great. She'd dodged dinner with fishy Jerry, but now she had to fake a date with the neighbor. Jennifer rubbed her temples. Yeah, can I lie down? I think I feel a headache coming on. Not a lie. Anytime she thought about dating again, the headaches would start up. Her mother waved her hands. Of course, dear. You go upstairs. There's some medicine in the cabinet in your bathroom. Jennifer took the opportunity and scrambled up the stairs. As she entered her old bedroom, the familiar scent of floor polish mixed with something else that was unique to her home hit her, and she sank down on her old bed. She shouldn't have stayed away for this long. It was just hard to face her past. And she knew the lingering memories of Mark would taint her visit. A noise came from outside, and she stood and looked out the window. Shane was in his backyard, chopping wood for his fireplace. She stared at him a minute, watching his muscles as he worked the axe. Dang. Skinny Shane had definitely filled out. He stepped back and stooped to pick up the wood. Now was her chance. If she hurried, she could catch him before he went back inside. She slipped on her boots, snuck down the stairs and out the door, careful not to make too much noise. Shane had his arms full of wood by the time she crossed the snowy yard to the chain-link fence that separated them. "Hey," she called out. He turned, his eyebrows raised. "Hi." Jennifer bit her lower lip, not sure how she would open up the conversation. "Do you need help?" He glanced at the fence between them. Not really."
Duh.
Of course not. Why had she said that? Right. The silence stretched between them and Jennifer panicked. "Will you do me a favor?" A favor? That was a dumb thing to say. Shane studied her for a second. "What do you need, Jennifer?" She gave him a half giggle and then felt ridiculous and sobered. "I told my mom you asked me out for tonight. She was going to set me up with Fishy." I mean, she's really wanting to set me up, but I don't really want to be in a relationship right now, so I told her you were taking me out. Would it be too much to ask?" Why were her words getting all garbled? Couldn't she say one intelligent thing? She rubbed her arms and waited for him to answer. Shane hesitated, and she wanted to bury herself in the snow. How could she think this was a good idea? She hadn't been friends with Shane since that summer back when they were 13. This was the dumbest idea ever. But then Shane nodded. "All right." "Really? You'll take me out tonight?" He stepped back. "Sure. My gosh, thank you so much. You don't know what you've done to help me out. You're a lifesaver." Jennifer would have given him a hug if there hadn't been a fence between them. And a pile of wood in his arms. "Can you come over around 6? He nodded. "Yes." "Great." She gave him a happy wave and picked her way back across the yard and into the house. Maybe this visit wouldn't be so bad after all. If her mom thought she had a thing going with Shane, she'd get left alone.
Chapter 3. Shane closed the back door with his foot and carried the fireplace wood into the living room. That was weird. Since when did Jennifer talk to him, much less ask him to do her a favor? And what's up with her wanting to go out with him? He shook his head as he filled the rack, then placed another log on the fire. "Who were you talking to, dear?" His mother came around the corner, a dish rag in her hands. "Jennifer Schmidt." "Do I know her?" "Yes. She grew up next door. Remember? We played together as kids." His mother rubbed her forehead. "Oh, yes. I remember now. How is she?" He brushed his hands off and shut the fireplace screen. "Fine." He hesitated, then said, "We're going out tonight. Going to catch up on old times." "That's nice." His mother looked at the dish rag in her hand and seemed confused for a moment before wandering back toward the kitchen. She was having one of her good days. Sometimes she didn't even recognize him. Those days hurt. Cora entered the room. She was his mother's part-time nurse. "I heard you were going out tonight. Do you want me to stay for the evening?" "That would be wonderful, Cora." "Thank you." Shane gave her a nod and left the living room. He checked the clock. An hour before he'd go on his date with Jennifer. Well, it wasn't really a date. It was a fake date. Oh, well. Was it pathetic that he was looking forward to spending the evening with her, even though she made it clear she was just using him as a relationship buffer? He ran a hand through his hair. Yep. It was pathetic. Shane jaunted down the stairs to his basement gym and worked out for 20 minutes. Then he took a shower and dressed for the evening. By the time he was ready, his stomach was in knots. Could he go out with Jennifer and pretend nothing weird was between them? Pretend she didn't break his heart and stomp on it when he was a teenager? He looked in the mirror and saw the same insecure boy from years ago. Closing his eyes, he shook his head. No, he wasn't the same kid. That was a long time ago. He was a grown man. And he could handle spending one evening with the woman who broke him.
Jennifer listened for Shane at the door while her mother shot questions at her. Yes, she'd dated since Mark. No, there was no one serious. Yes, she liked Shane. No, they hadn't been keeping in touch. Yes, he was a fine, young man. No, she wasn't an old maid, at the age of 30. Okay, maybe that last one wasn't actually spoken, but that's how she felt. Why was her mother making such a big deal out of getting married and settling down? She was fine. A bit lonely, but still fine. She didn't need a man to make her happy. The doorbell rang and instant relief flooded over her as she jumped up from her chair. It's Shane. Don't wait up for me. Her mother scoffed and shot her a disapproving look. I'm kidding. She kissed her mother's cheek and rushed to answer the door. Shane stood on the porch, his hands in his coat pockets, and she couldn't have been happier to see him.
Bye.
She called as she grabbed her coat and slipped out the door. So glad to see you, she said under her breath. Why? My word. You'd think I had a goiter or some big fat ugly mole on my face the way my mother is going on, and on about how limited my dating pool is. She rolled her eyes and Shane chuckled. A goiter? Yes. My mom thinks I'm a social outcast, I'll never get married and never give her the grandbabies she deserves. Shane fell into step beside her. That bad? You wouldn't even believe it. I think she mentioned my ticking clock at least 5 times. Like my ovaries have some kind of time bomb on them. He gave her a half grin. She cares about you. That's all. She blew a strand of hair from her face and nodded, rubbing her hands together. Why didn't she ever remember gloves? I know. I just get a little smothered from all the caring about me. She doesn't mean any harm. She nodded and smiled up at Shane. You're right. I'll stop complaining now. Where do you want to go? He stepped up to his car and opened the passenger door for her. That depends. How fake do you want this fake date to be? What do you mean? He looked down at his hands. Do you really want to have dinner with me? Or should I drop you off at the mall? Jennifer was taken aback, and her mouth dropped open. How could he think she'd want him to leave her alone somewhere? They were friends. Dinner with you? Definitely. He smiled, but it looked reserved. Okay, then. Do you want Mexican, Chinese or Italian? Italian. He shut her door and walked around the car to climb into the driver's seat. Then he turned to her. You do know that means Larry's Pizza on the square, right? Jennifer laughed. Of course. Shane started the car and pulled out onto the street. Italian it is. After a few moments they were walking into the restaurant together. The heavy smell of dough and cheese made her mouth water. Shane pulled out a red vinyl chair for her at a table for 2. She pointed to the large gumball machine sitting in the corner by the front door. Remember that time we walked here as kids? We each got a gumball. Those things were so big we could hardly close our mouths around them. Shane grinned. I haven't thought about that in a long time. You were upset that I got the pink one, so we traded. You always knew what to do to make me happy. Jennifer picked up a laminated menu from between the salt and pepper shakers and scanned the items, even though she knew what she would get. He did the same, and when the waitress came she took their drink orders, brought them their sodas and pulled out her notepad. Do you know what you want? I'll take the ravioli, Shane said. I haven't tried it yet. Sure. The waitress gave him a flirty smile. And you? She was talking to Jennifer, but her eyes were still on Shane, which was annoying. Jennifer felt like slapping the woman. Can I have a personal-sized pan with pineapple and cream cheese? The waitress wrinkled her nose and finally looked at her. I don't know if we have that. You do, Shane said. She always orders that. The gal wrote something on her pad. Okay, then. I'll have them make it. After the waitress left, Shane gave her a funny look. Why are you so predictable? Jennifer leaned back in her chair and scoffed. He would label her as predictable. I just know what I like and I go after it. There's nothing wrong with that, is there? Shane stiffened for a second before picking up his Coke and taking a sip. Then he set it back down and folded his fingers together. Nope. So, tell me. What's been going on with your life? I feel like we haven't talked in ages. A guarded look came over his face. Nothing much has been happening. I work at the feedlot. Come home smelling like cows. Mom has a nurse checking in on her while I'm not there. Otherwise, I'm at home with her. And what about college? Are you ever going to finish school? His gaze flickered to his drink and he fiddled with the straw. Someday. He seemed uncomfortable with her line of questioning, so she changed the subject. How's the old gang from school? Do you ever see Pepper or Hank? I heard they were still around. Shane stared at her. Those were your friends, he said, his tone flat. What are you talking about? They were everyone's friends. We all went to the same school. The same parties. No. We didn't. She had to lean forward to hear him, his voice was so quiet. She waved away his bad mood. Come on. I swear I saw you at the parties. You just hung out with that short kid. What was his name? Lance. She clapped her hands together. Yes. Lance. You and he would go everywhere together. What's he up to now? I think he designs video games for a living.
Ha!
Really? That's so him. Their food came and Jennifer picked up a slice, taking a bite. The sweet and creamy flavor filled her mouth.
Mmm.
That's the good stuff, she said after she swallowed. Then she pointed to his plate. Do you like their ravioli? It's decent. You should have gotten the meat lover's pizza. I know you like that one. I did when I was 12, he said quietly. She cocked her head at him. He really had changed since she'd known him. I guess. They sat in silence for a while longer while they ate. After their food was gone, Jennifer wiped her hands on her napkin. Should we see what's playing at the theater? Shane didn't answer right away. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. I actually told my mother I would put up the tree tonight. We're behind on Christmas decorating. A jolt of excitement shot through Jennifer. It had been years since she'd gotten into the holiday spirit. She couldn't remember the last time she'd put up a tree. Awesome. I'll string the lights. He looked at her like she'd just swallowed her fork. What? You want to help? Sure. Come on. Let's go decorate your tree. She stood and gathered up her trash. He hesitated, then joined her. Okay. First we have to go pick one out.
Chapter 4. Shane turned the steering wheel, pulling out into traffic while Jennifer played with her phone. What was he doing? Why didn't he make some kind of excuse and drop Jennifer back off at home? He must really like to torture himself. When he got to the tree farm, he opened her car door for her and reached down to help her up. The second her soft skin slid into his, he regretted the motion. Warmth traveled up his arm, and his heart stuttered. As soon as she was out of the car, he let go and shoved his hands in his coat pockets. He couldn't get all gaga over Jennifer again. It was obvious by their dinner conversation she saw their past very differently than he did. He had to be careful or he would just cause himself more heartache. Should we start over there? He asked, pointing. Sure. Jennifer took a step toward the row of trees. Looks good. He followed behind her, watching her inspect the trees. She fiddled with the branches as they walked, running her hand over the needles. Curious, he finally stopped. What are you doing? I read that if you gently grab the inside of a branch, then pull your hand toward you, if the needles come off your tree won't last very long. But if they stay on, it's a good tree. I'm just testing these. You read that? Where? Her cheeks turned pink. I googled it on my phone as you drove. That's what she'd been doing on her phone. He smiled down at her, forgetting his resolve not to like her. That was sweet of you. I wanted to seem knowledgeable. I've never picked out a tree before. He gaped at her. Never? Doesn't your mother put up a tree? Yes, every year. She looked up at him. But it's plastic. That's a travesty. He said it with a straight face, but when Jennifer cracked a smile he couldn't hold it in and laughed. A travesty, huh? She slid her hand through the crook of his arm. Then I guess I should thank you for opening up this new world to me. Her slim frame pressed next to him, and his heart rate sped up. How many times had he imagined Jennifer on his arm? And how often did he have to watch her hanging on someone else? He wanted to pull away, but her smile was so genuine, he couldn't. Yeah. I guess so. She looked up at the night sky. Oh, it's snowing. She raised her hands into the air as a few flakes drifted down. How magical is that? A flake landed on his eyelash and he blinked, trying to get it off. Jennifer laughed and reached up to brush it away with her thumb. She paused, staring up at him, and the mood shifted. His gaze dipped to her lips. He'd often imagined kissing her back in the day. What would she do now if he did? And then he realized how crazy that was and pulled back. He couldn't kiss Jennifer. What was he thinking? Thanks. She exhaled, her breath coming out in a fog. Yeah. He pointed to a tree. What do you think of this one? Jennifer tested the branches and gave it her approval. It's healthy. And I like how it's tall but not too wide. I think this would make a great tree. He nodded, patting her shoulder. We have it, then. Let's get it. Half an hour later he was dragging the tree into the house, Jennifer laughing as he struggled with it. He shot her what he meant to be a glare, but he was sure it came out all wrong when he laughed as well. She ran to open the door. As he neared, she called out, "Go a little to the left." With Jennifer's help, he was able to drag the tree into the living room. He lifted the tree into the stand and heard a scraping sound. Oh, no. Don't tell me I bought one that was too tall. Jennifer shifted on her feet, her hand up to her mouth. He tightened the stand and stood back. The top bent over as it pressed up against the ceiling. He looked at it sideways, biting his cheek. Jennifer pressed her lips together, obviously trying not to laugh. It's not so bad. She stepped back. It just looks like you lowered the ceiling. He couldn't help it, he laughed. Jennifer joined in, and soon they were almost in tears. When they finally stopped, he shook his head. I'll see if I can find a different tree. No, I like this one. It has character. The star won't go on the top. Sure, it will. We can make it work. Jennifer plastered on a bright smile, and Shane turned away. He didn't want to admit her smile warmed him. He couldn't be thinking about how pretty she looked with her cheeks pink from the cold. Or how her laugh took him right back to high school when he had an enormous crush on her. He had to back away or she could destroy him. Shane pulled a little clay snowman out of the ornament box and put a hook on the loop. He handed it to Jennifer so she could hang it on the tree. He liked how the lights reflected in her eyes, and how she smiled when she took each ornament from him. They'd been decorating the tree for over an hour. All the lights were strung and there were only a few last ornaments to hang. The fire crackled, making the room cozy. She stood there, studying the figure. That's adorable. Did you make this? He chuckled, shifting on the couch. When I was 7. I love it. There's so many homemade ornaments on your tree. It makes it so personal. It's really nice your mom kept all the ones you made as a kid. There was a sad tone to Jennifer's voice, and Shane wasn't sure what it meant. Didn't you make ornaments when you were growing up? Yes, but mother threw them away the next year. Shane stared at her, horrified. One of the best things about Christmas was getting to look at all the things that brought back those happy memories. He swallowed, his throat tightening at the thought of a mother who could toss something like that so easily. She did. Our tree has a theme. All manger scenes. She's collected them from all over the world. It really does look neat. Yeah, but why throw away the things you made? Didn't that hurt your feelings as a kid? She avoided looking him in the eye and shrugged. I guess. But Mom always said she enjoyed it for a whole season and it was time to declutter. Ouch. I tried not to let it hurt. She likes a tidy house. Jennifer turned and hung the ornament on a branch. But I like seeing what you made when you were little. I think I'll have a tree like this when I get married and have kids. So, that's a goal of yours, then? Shane cringed. Why did he ask that? She turned back around, her gaze connecting with his. Of course. It's always been my goal. That's why. She stopped and pinched her lips together. Shane didn't want to press, but he was curious. Why, what? She shook her head. It's stupid. He reached into the box for the next ornament but his fingers only scraped the bottom. He set the box aside. I'm sure it's not. Jennifer sighed and plopped down on the couch beside him. She twisted her fingers together, the silence between them stretching. Finally, she looked up at him. I shouldn't have gotten engaged to Mark, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Why not? Weren't you in love with him? She blinked, moisture gathering in her eyes. I knew things weren't right between us. We were fighting more. I should have known things weren't going to work out. Shane's heart went out to her. Jennifer was the sweetest girl he knew. She had a tender heart. He placed his hand on hers. How would you have known? She blinked and a tear traveled down her cheek. I was being naive about the wedding. No. You see the good in people. You always have. That's not naivety, that's your kind nature showing through. He reached out and brushed a tear from her face with the pad of his thumb, his fingers threading through her hair. It was so soft, he couldn't stop himself. She closed her eyes and leaned into the palm of his hand. You've always been good to me, Jennifer said. Shane couldn't stop himself. He pulled Jennifer closer until he could smell her coconut shampoo. He cupped her face, her smooth skin under his rough hands making his heart beat faster. She opened her eyes and he was swallowed up in her blue gaze. Why didn't we date in high school? Her words came out quiet, almost a whisper, but they pierced his soul. He slowly backed away. He couldn't look at her, those large innocent eyes staring at him, and tell her what she'd done to him. She had no clue. No reason, he said, turning away from her, swallowing the pain from so long ago as it rose up in his throat. He suddenly stood, looking at the clock on the wall. Wow, it's late. I didn't realize. I'd better walk you home or your mother is going to give me the stink eye. Jennifer laughed. Stink eye? What does that even look like? He wasn't sure, but he gave it a try, and she made a face. You look constipated. I guess I'll have to work on that. Shane helped Jennifer into her coat, then walked her to her mother's house. As he stood on the front porch with her, she quickly lifted up on her toes and gave him a peck on the cheek. Thanks for tonight. I had a lot of fun. He swallowed, trying not to show how stunned he was she'd kissed his cheek. I had fun, too. See you tomorrow. Yeah. See ya. He squeezed her hand and turned away. As he walked home, he resolved not to be disappointed if he didn't see her tomorrow. She was busy. And in 10 days she would be returning to her life in New York. No need to get all tangled up in something that wasn't going to be.
Chapter 5. Jennifer stepped out of the shower, toweling off as the smell of breakfast came wafting up the stairs. Her mother was making blueberry waffles. She swallowed, her mouth watering already. Her mother hadn't made her waffles in forever. As she dressed, thoughts of Shane kept invading her privacy. He'd grown into such a handsome man. His voice was now low and had a sexy timbre. And he smelled amazing. She had the best time last night. And she was pretty sure he'd been close to kissing her. She closed her eyes and imagined what that would be like. What are you doing? Her mother stood in the doorway, her hand on her hip. Jennifer felt the heat rush to her cheeks as she pulled her cardigan around her. She was sure she'd been standing there making a kissy face at no one. Nothing. Come on down for breakfast. The familiar sound of chopping wood came from outside and her mother walked to the window. There's Shane. You should ask him to come eat with us. He likes blueberry waffles, right? My word. So, that's why her mother made them. Shane's favorite back in the day. How could she have forgotten? She sighed and slipped into her boots. I'll go ask. Perfect. Her mother gave her a smile, and she couldn't help but return it. Even though her mom was stepping over the line, she had to admit she wanted to spend more time with Shane. Jennifer slipped into her coat and walked outside, through the same footprints she'd left yesterday. Shane was once again sporting a pile of wood in his arms and walking toward his house. Hey, she called. He turned and smiled. Hi. We keep meeting like this. I know. Weird. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a t-shirt that hugged his chest muscles. Need another fake date? No. Mom is wondering if you want to come over and have breakfast with us. He raised an eyebrow. Really?
Yeah.
I guess she has stopped matchmaking me with Fishy Jerry and now has someone else in mind. He chuckled. I see. So, you game? He slowly nodded. All right. Let me put this inside, then I'll be over. She watched as he disappeared into his house. Then, as she waited, she got a wicked idea. She snuck over to the gate and slipped into his yard, gathered up a handful of snow, and packed it into a snowball. Then she hid behind the fir tree. Shane came out, still without a coat. As he crossed his yard, she tossed the snowball. It landed on his shoulder and he yelped. Jennifer couldn't help it. She laughed. Shane swiveled around, the shock evident on his face. You threw snow at me? It's called a snowball. Pretty much the only fun thing you can do with the stuff. Remember when we were kids, and we'd build forts and have an epic snowball? She was interrupted by an ice-cold ball of snow whacking her in the face. She wiped bits of snow from her cheek. You're gonna get it now. She ran as he sprinted across the yard away from her. She gathered up a snowball and threw it as hard as she could. It missed him. He laughed. I'm going to get it? Really? You are. Just hold still a second. She scooped up more snow, but missed him again. When is the payback coming? Because, I don't see any. His broad smile taunted her. She waited until he'd stopped running. Okay, I give up. Let's go eat. All right. He walked toward her and fell into step beside her. When he wasn't paying attention, she grabbed a handful of snow and stuffed it down the back of his shirt. Shane howled and moved like his shirt was on fire. Jennifer's sides hurt from laughing so hard. Then he reached out and before she knew it, he'd grabbed her around the middle. No, you don't. That was so unfair. You got me in the face. You deserved it. She struggled to get away from him while he tried to scoop up some snow to get her back. Unfortunately, her boot hit an icy patch and she slipped. Shane toppled down as well. Jennifer lay in the snow, cold spreading across her skin, while Shane stared at her from above. You okay? She giggled.
Yeah.
Just embarrassed. I'm a major klutz. And I probably look atrocious now. No need to be embarrassed. His smile faded. You're beautiful. She gazed up at him, his chocolate brown eyes pulling her in. This is the Shane she remembered. The one who laughed easily and who went out of his way to make sure she was okay. The one who made her feel like she was all that mattered. Go out with me. Jennifer sucked in a breath. She hadn't meant to blurt it out like that. But now that she had, she tacked onto it, for real this time. Shane stood and extended his hand to her. After he helped her up, she waited for him to say something. He brushed the snow from his clothes and started toward her house. Is that a yes? He gave her a smile. Nope. Jennifer's heart plummeted. Wait, what? Why not? He shoved his hands in his pockets. Too busy. Christmas is almost here, you know. He was smiling, but there was something reserved about it, and she couldn't tell if he was joking around or if he was serious. Well, how about another fake date? It would help keep my mother off my back. He raised an eyebrow. We'll see. Chapter 6. Jennifer watched Shane turn and walk toward her house, her head reeling. What had he meant by that? We'll see. And then it struck her. Maybe he was in a relationship, and all this time she just assumed he was single. Holy cow, she felt awful. She ran to catch up to him. Shane, wait. I'm sorry. Sorry for what? He didn't look at her. Just kept walking toward her porch. Sorry for assuming you weren't dating anyone. She grabbed his arm. Come on, slow down. It's cold out here. He said the words, but then he slowed anyway. She walked up the steps with him. Who is she? He turned to her. I'm not dating anyone. And with that, he walked into her house, leaving her on the porch and wondering what he'd meant. She rushed inside to see her mother with her hands on Shane's cheeks. Dear me. You poor boy. You're freezing. Come in and sit at the table. Thank you, Mary. Jennifer itched to ask him if he had been joking around with her, but there was no way she wanted her mother in the middle of the conversation, so she pressed her lips together and sat down beside Shane. Her mother forked a couple of waffles onto their plates, then sat down at the table, even though there wasn't a plate in front of her. Jennifer cut into her food with a fork. Her mother leaned forward. So, are you two dating now? Mom, she warned. That's not a bad question. Is that a bad question? She turned to Shane. You'd think I asked if you hooked up or something. Jennifer's face burned. Mom. Well, I didn't. I just want to know if you're seeing each other. Is that so bad? A mother, wanting to know who her daughter is dating? Shane reached over and put his hand on top of Jennifer's. We had a wonderful date last night, and today, Jennifer asked me out again. He smiled, although it didn't reach his eyes. Her mother didn't notice. She said, clutching at her necklace. Well, that's lovely. She stood and pushed her chair in. I should let you two eat and talk. I'm sure you have lots to say. She hurried out of the room. Shane pulled his hand back and Jennifer fanned her face. Sorry, she said. Could that have been any more embarrassing? I can't believe her sometimes. You'd think she had no social graces. It's fine. She squinted at him, wanting to ask about their awkward conversation, but decided to ignore it. So, what do you do around here for fun? He chuckled. Fun? You know, she said, grinning at him. The thing you do when you're not working or being bored. I don't know what you're talking about. She scoffed. Then I'll have to show you what fun is. He raised an eyebrow, like he enjoyed the challenge. Really? Tonight. I'm taking you out to have fun. They still have that ice rink downtown, right? Shane made a face. No. You can't do that to me. What? She poked him in the side. Not afraid of a little ice, are you? Only when I fall and break through it. It's not a real pond. You can't break through, you wimp. A wimp? She could tell he was trying to hide a smile. How about a realist? Come on. Skate with me. She peeked to make sure her mother couldn't hear. We have to do something on our fake date. He sobered up. Okay. Skating it is. He pushed his plate away. This was a fantastic breakfast. Please tell your mother thank you. I'd better be heading home now. I will. Jennifer walked him to the door and watched as he trekked across the snow, her heart pounding in her ears. Shane was acting a little strange, and she vowed to get him to open up to her about it. Jennifer pressed the doorbell, her nerves in a jangle. She held a plate of banana bread her mother insisted she take to Shane's house. Her mother didn't think it was enough for them to go out tonight. So, she'd send her over with the treat. Would this humiliation ever end? Shane opened the door. I should have guessed it was you. He smiled. I'm sorry. My mother wouldn't take no for an answer. She held out the plate of banana bread. She insisted I bring this over. He chuckled and opened the door wider. Come on in. If you go home now, I have a feeling you'll show up in 10 minutes with something else. Correct. She gave him a thank you smile. You've saved me from further shame. He rubbed the back of his neck. Well, since you're here, maybe you could save me from my own shame. He pointed to the rolls of wrapping paper and the mess that looked like he was trying to wrap a package. Jennifer grinned. No problem. I'm a master wrapper. You've asked the right person. Thank goodness, because I was about to give up and just shove it in a garbage sack. No way. We will not give up. Let's get this thing done. She sat down and crossed her legs. Give me the scissors and we'll get started. Shane joined her on the floor. As she sliced through the paper, he grew silent. She nudged him. What are you thinking? Sorry. I'm probably not going to be great company today. Mom's not having a good day. She doesn't know who I am today. She keeps telling me to get out of the house. No. Jennifer squeezed his hand, unsure of what else she could do. She had no idea what that would be like, but it must be awful. I'm so sorry. He took her hand, enveloping it with both of his. You're sweet to care. Your mom was always good to me growing up. She was kind. Remember that time I scraped my knee and my mom wasn't home? Your mother calmed me down and put a band-aid on it. She wiped away my tears and told me a popsicle would cure any ailment. He laughed. She was right, though, wasn't she? Jennifer grinned. Definitely. After a moment she sobered. What are you going to do about your mother? Shane sighed and ran a hand over the back of his neck. I don't know. I don't want to move her out of her home, but she gets so agitated that it scares me. And sometimes it's more than I or the nurse can handle. There's a really good facility in Harrison, and it's only 30 minutes away. Jennifer bit her lip. I know it feels like you're betraying her, but she might need more care than you can give her. Shane swallowed, his jaw muscles working. I guess I can look into it. I'll go with you to visit the facility, if you want. He squeezed her hand again. Thanks. That would mean a lot to me.
Chapter 7. Shane tightened the shoelaces on his skates, sure this would not end well. I can't believe you convinced me to do this. It's been way too long since I've been skating. Jennifer beamed. It will be a blast. And Mother's so happy we're out on another date. You've made her the happiest. Well, at least she's happy. Who cares if I totally embarrass myself? She laughed and lightly slapped him on the shoulder. You'll be fine. Come on, look at all the 12-year-olds busting it up on the ice. That's what I'm afraid of. Being bested by a bunch of kids. She tugged on his hand and he stood up. Don't be such a baby. All right, he said, laughing. I'm a man. I'll show you how macho I am. He stepped out onto the ice and slipped a little. See? Manly men aren't afraid to fall. She raised one eyebrow. Really? Watch this now. He shoved off the wall and bent his knees, trying to skate toward the middle. Unfortunately, a kid whizzed by him and he lost his balance, falling on his butt. Jennifer giggled and held out a hand. Okay, that's enough macho for now. Hold my hand and I'll help you stay upright. Shane took her hand and immediately regretted it. The feel of her skin on his was amazing. But he couldn't let go, not while she was helping him. So, he kept a hold of her and tried to ignore the butterflies in his gut going crazy. Remember when that ice storm came through during Christmas break that one year? Jennifer smiled, her cheeks pink with the cold. He nodded. Yeah. We spent hours pretending we were skating on that big ice patch in the street. I think your mother had to drag us back inside so we could get warmed up. She bribed us with hot chocolate. Her eyes lit up. Yeah, with those tiny marshmallows. That was the best. He almost lost his balance again, but Jennifer steadied him. He looked at her. Thanks. You're getting the hang of it. Just don't look down at your feet so much. They skated for another hour, and just as Shane was feeling confident, it was time to leave. He put his boots back on while Jennifer talked about how much she missed the times they would make snow angels. What's stopping you? He said as they walked toward the car. Stopping me? From making more snow angels. Jennifer laughed so hard, it sounded like it came from her toes. Seriously? He pointed to someone's lawn, the blanket of snow undisturbed. I'm serious. Right here. I dare you. She peered up and down the street, like she was a criminal, about to steal diamonds. All right. But you have to do it too. He chuckled and nodded. Challenge accepted. Jennifer plopped down in the snow and laid back, then she raised her arms up and down and moved her legs. Shane took a step down the sidewalk and did the same. The cold snow froze his neck, but he couldn't stop laughing as he created a snow angel on some random person's lawn. After he stood, he helped her up. Her hands were freezing, and he held on to them. Where are your gloves? You're going to get frostbite. Her cheeks colored. I always forget them. I think they're in my room. He pulled his gloves from his pockets and slid them on her hands. There. A little big on you, but at least you won't freeze. She peered up at him, her gaze intense for a moment. Thanks. He looked down into her eyes, falling into the blue depths. She was beautiful. Everything he'd ever wanted. And she was here, with him. Her lips parted slightly and he couldn't tear his gaze away from them. Before he could think about it, his lips were on hers. While her hands were freezing, her lips were delightfully warm, and he pulled her closer to him as she responded to the kiss. He'd dreamt about kissing her his whole life, and now, as it was happening, he couldn't help but think of how more amazing it was than even in his wildest dreams. Her lips tasted sweet, her warmth enveloping him. Jennifer had always been what he wanted. At least, until that day when he'd overheard her talking to her friends. Her words from that day echoed in his head, after one of the popular kids asked her about him. Oh, him. He's nobody. He pulled back from her, remembering the sting and heartache he'd felt. She'd blown off their friendship, like it hadn't mattered at all. She'd wanted to be popular. And she got her wish. Jennifer smiled up at him, and he realized what a mistake it had been to kiss her. She wasn't what he'd thought she was growing up. She was a fake. And he needed to remember that. He backed away from her. Sorry. I didn't, we shouldn't. No more words would come out and he turned from her, unable to form a complete sentence. She tugged on his arm, her eyebrows pulled together. What do you mean? She didn't know he'd overheard her. She didn't understand, and he couldn't open up that past wound and tell her. So, he lied. You're going back to New York. I'm staying here. It's not fair for me to start something we can't possibly sustain. Oh. Jennifer blinked a few times, then she nodded. I understand. Good. Because I don't want to hurt you. Those words were true. No, I get it. She smiled, although it seemed forced. I'm leaving in a week. I can see how you wouldn't want to have a long-distance relationship. She was agreeing with him, saying it was okay not to get closer, and Shane should have felt relief, but instead, something inside him felt hollow. He nodded. Good. I'm glad we are on the same page. Yeah. She rubbed her hands together. Me too. Shane took Jennifer home and readied for bed, the hollow feeling never leaving.
Chapter 8. Jennifer lay on her bed staring at her ceiling. Shane had kissed her, and it had been amazing. She'd never felt such attraction before. Such a thrill when a man pressed his lips to her. They still tingled and she reached up to touch them. But he'd pulled away, physically, and she saw him pull away emotionally. He didn't want to get too close to her. Didn't want to start a relationship with someone who was leaving town. She bit her bottom lip. It had hurt, she had to admit. But another part of her had been screaming at her. Tell him you'd stay. The thought made her tingle with anticipation, and freak out, with the implications. She'd known Shane forever, but only recently had she started to feel something for him. They'd been connecting. But did that mean she was ready to move back to her hometown? It didn't seem like a very rational decision. However, at the same time, she really liked Shane. And what did she have in New York? A stupid job where she was lower on the totem pole than the receptionist? She had hoped to work her way up, but even after 5 years she was still the girl who ran to get coffee orders, or the one they sent to pick up the dry cleaning. She was worth more than that. But could she quit and come back home? The thought made her balk. She didn't want to be that girl. The one who went away to achieve her dreams, but then failed and came back with her tail between her legs. Plus, Mark was still here, and she really didn't want to run into him. On the other hand, Jennifer couldn't stop thinking about how sweet Shane had been yesterday. How he'd gone skating with her, even though he could barely keep standing. How he'd made snow angels with her. How his arms felt wrapped around her. She missed that. Missed the way it felt to have a man smile at her. Missed the hand-holding and the stolen kisses. She sighed and shoved her pillow over her head. She was so stupid. Why couldn't she keep her head on straight when it came to men? She was forever making poor decisions and winding up getting hurt. She couldn't lose her head over Shane. It just wasn't smart. After she showered, she grabbed an apple and walked into the living room. Her mother's Christmas tree stood in front of the windows. Icicle lights hung outside. She slid onto the couch and watched the gas fireplace as the flames licked at the fake wood inside. This is how she felt. Fake. Her life was for show, and nothing more. She had a useless, dead-end job. Sure, she lived in New York, but she rarely did anything to enjoy the city. She had no close friends. Had nothing to come home to. Her phone made a noise and she picked it up, looking at the screen. Shane sent a text message. "How are you today?" She smiled as she texted him back. "I'm fine. You?" He answered right away. "A little sore from all the falling down yesterday." Jennifer laughed. "You were such a good sport." There was a pause before he answered her back. "Did you mean it when you said you would go with me to the facility in Harrison?" "Of course I meant it. When do you want to leave?" She waited a second before his text came through. 10 minutes? Her heartbeat picked up speed as she answered. "You got it." Jennifer ran upstairs to run a brush through her hair. After last night, she didn't want to get too excited about being with Shane, but yet, she couldn't help but notice how her skin tingled when he was around. And how she hadn't felt like this in years. By the time he knocked on her door, she had worked herself up into a ball of nerves. She opened the door and he stood there, his dark hair slightly ruffled as if he had been running his hand through it. She wanted to reach up and smooth it down, but refrained. "Hey," she said as she slipped her coat on and stepped outside. "Thanks for coming with me." He looked down at the porch. "I didn't want to go alone." She looped her hand in the crook of his arm. "It will be okay. Let's go check it out." On the way to Harrison, Jennifer tried to keep the conversation light and upbeat. She didn't want Shane getting depressed. She clicked on the radio and turned it to the Christmas music station, then started singing along when her favorite came on, Jingle Bells. Shane looked at her sideways. "I didn't know you sang." She laughed. "Well, I don't know if I'd call it singing. It's more, me trying to keep a tune." "You sound good. Keep singing." She tried to, but as he stared at her she started laughing. "Only if you join me. I feel too self-conscious otherwise." "All right." They sang along to the Christmas songs on the radio the rest of the way to Harrison. When Shane arrived at the Shady Pine, Jennifer was happy they were both in a good mood. Shane looked at the brick building and took in a deep breath. She reached over and squeezed his hand. Don't worry. Let's go inside and look around. Thanks. Jennifer walked with him into the building. A woman approached them right away, graying hair pulled back and a smile on her face. What can I do for you? When Shane didn't speak, Jennifer jumped in. Can we have a tour? Sure. Let me get Kelly. She's the one who usually does them. The woman disappeared behind a door and a younger woman appeared, wearing a pencil skirt. Welcome to Savannah House. My name is Kelly and I'd love to show you around the facility. Shane swallowed and Jennifer nodded. Yes, thank you. Kelly took them to the cafeteria, which looked more like a nice restaurant, with large open spaces and tablecloths. We serve home-style meals, and we let the patrons order what they'd like. We find it suits their needs better. Makes them feel more comfortable. They passed through the commons areas where people were watching television together or playing games. Kelly showed them a room and how the patron decorated it like home. We don't like the hospital look here. We want our guests to feel at home. As they walked, she could see Shane nodding. When they got to the end, Shane picked up a pamphlet. Thank you for the tour. He shook Kelly's hand. I appreciate you showing us around. After they got in the car, Jennifer turned to him. What did you think? This is a very nice facility. I'm sure Mother would feel comfortable here. He scrubbed his hand over his face. I'm just not sure I'm ready to remove her from her home. Take your time. You don't have to decide right now. You're right. Shane started the engine and leaned over, giving her a peck on the cheek. Thank you for coming with me today. You've been a real support.
Chapter 9. Shane peered out of the window, watching the snow fall. It had been 2 days since he'd seen Jennifer, and his muscles were aching to walk over to her house. What was wrong with him? He knew she was leaving in just a few days. Plus, she was not in his league. She never was. But if he were honest with himself, he missed talking to her. Missed being with her. What a sucker. 5 more days, and she'd be gone. She was all about getting out of this town when they were kids. And she'd gotten her wish. She had some fancy job in New York. She would never be able to think of him as anything other than a loser who still lived at home with his mother. A nobody. Her words from so long ago stung, and he shoved away from the window. He had to stop looking at her house, wishing things were different. A moment later he heard a scraping sound and couldn't help himself. He looked out again. Jennifer was outside, shoveling her mother's walkway. Her hair was pulled up into a messy bun, and she had no gloves on. He sighed and grabbed his coat. He may be out of her league, but he wasn't going to let her shovel the walkway by herself. Before he stepped out, he grabbed a second pair of gloves. She looked up as he walked up toward her carrying a shovel. He extended the gloves. The cold isn't good for your skin. She blushed and shoved her hands into them. Thanks. I actually tried to find mine, but couldn't. Glad I could help, then. He began scooping off the part she hadn't gotten to yet. Have you been busy? She eyed him. A bit of guilt wormed its way through his chest. He'd been ignoring her texts. Yeah. Your mom? She asked, her voice softer. No. She's been having a good couple of days. Oh. Jennifer pressed her lips together. After a few minutes of silence, Shane couldn't stand the guilt any longer. Sorry, I haven't been very responsive. That's okay. You've got your own stuff going on. Crud, he could see the hurt in her eyes, and even though he resolved to distance himself, he couldn't stand to see her like this. Want to go to the Christmas tree lighting ceremony with me tonight? She looked at him, her gaze measured. Would this be a fake date, or a real date? He didn't want to call it a date, but didn't want to hurt her even further. How about 2 friends getting into the Christmas spirit? She smiled. Sounds good to me. He pointed. I'll finish up this way if you want to take the end. Sure. After he scooped for a minute, Jennifer stopped and turned to him. Shane. Yeah. Thanks for coming over. I appreciate the friendship. He wasn't sure how to take the way she'd said it, but nodded and pretended to tip a hat. "You're welcome. I was hoping you weren't mad at me." "Mad at you?" He leaned a hand on the top of his shovel. "What for?" She stared down at her boots. "I guess I've been imposing on you the last few days." "I didn't mean to, and I'm sorry." "Imposing?" Gah, he hadn't meant to make her feel that way. He shook his head. "You're never an imposition." She gave him a small smile. "Thanks." He continued to shovel, but the mood had shifted, and he wanted to keep things light between them. "You remember that summer we had that block party?" She looked up at him. "Yeah. They squirted water out of the fire hydrant and we thought that was the coolest thing. All the kids were running around it, getting soaked, while the adults grilled hot dogs. And you found that tiny frog." "Oh, my gosh." Jennifer pointed her shovel at him. "You wanted to put that thing in your mouth, and I wouldn't let you." He chuckled. "I was showing off. I had a crush on you." Shane almost choked. Why had he said that? He hadn't meant to tell her about his lifelong crush. He froze, waiting to see her reaction. She laughed, shaking her head. "You were determined to get that frog in your mouth. I thought you were going to kill the poor thing." Shane sucked in a breath. She'd completely ignored what he'd said. Maybe it didn't matter to her. Or she hadn't paid attention. Whatever the reason, he was glad she hadn't stopped to comment on it. "I never would have killed it. You scared me to death. For that, I sincerely apologize." She gave him a wide smile. "You're sweet, Shane." He just shook his head at her and continued to shovel. He had to admit, his mood had lifted since he'd come outside to be with Jennifer.
Chapter 10. Jennifer walked beside Shane, the sound of the gathering crowd sending excitement through her. She'd missed this town tradition and hadn't even realized it. Along the sidewalk, food trucks sold cake funnels shaped into Christmas trees, hot chocolate with whipped cream, and marshmallow snowmen on a stick. A horse and carriage gave people rides through the small downtown district. Shane's hand brushed against hers and he looked down at her. "Your hands are freezing. Did you forget your gloves again?" "No. I made an executive decision." He made a face. "You decided to let your fingers freeze?" She held in a giggle. "No, I decided that gloves would be too bulky for tonight." She pointed to his hands. "You're not wearing them." "All right. You win. But we should get you some hot chocolate to warm up your fingers." She grinned at him. "Deal." Shane steered them toward the line. As they waited, he rubbed his hands together. "So, tell me about your fancy job in New York." She raised an eyebrow. Where had he heard that? Fancy job?
Yeah.
Your mom told me about some high-paying gig you found. She was bragging on you one time. I forget what she said you were doing, though. What is it you do? Brother. Her mother had been lying to people around town? That's just great. Jennifer snorted and felt her cheeks redden. I don't have a high-paying job. I'm an assistant. He seemed surprised. Really? I'm sorry. I could have sworn your mother said. I'm sure she did, Jennifer interrupted. But mother is a bit too concerned about appearances. He shifted. Well, an assistant is a fine job. Who do you work for? Thomas and Williams. It's an ad agency. Are you an assistant to Thomas or Williams? Shane chuckled at his own joke. I'm actually an assistant to an assistant. She blew a strand of hair from her face. I know it sounds glamorous, but I really spend the day running errands for people. Shane slipped his hand around hers and his warm skin sent tingles up her arm. I'm sure you're invaluable. She squeezed his hand. Not really, but thank you for trying. It was their turn to order, so Shane stepped up to the window. After a moment he handed her a cup of hot cocoa, keeping one for himself. He paid and they continued to walk toward the square, cups of steamy liquid in hand. He turned to her. Are you happy in New York? Then he winced. Sorry. I didn't mean it to sound like that. I was just trying to make conversation. She didn't mind Shane asking about how she liked New York. To be honest, she'd been trying to find a way to bring it up, since part of the reason he didn't want to get too cozy with her was because she was going back there. No, it's okay. I know what you meant. And I don't know, to be honest. She snuck a peek at him. I have been wondering what things might look like if I decided to move back here. Shane had just taken a sip of his hot chocolate and choked on it. He coughed for a second before staring at her. You what? She bit her lip self-consciously. Was it too presumptuous for her to say? She didn't want Shane to feel awkward, but yet, she wanted him to know she liked him enough to explore where a relationship could go between them. Jennifer? The voice made Jennifer freeze and turn around slowly. Mark? Jennifer felt the color drain from her face as Mark stood there, his arm around some Barbie doll blonde. He pointed to her. Hey, it's been a while. How've you been? A while? Try, since he left her standing at the altar. The humiliation descended upon her once again, and she had a hard time not digging a hole in the snow. I'm fine. Mark's gaze traveled over Shane, and then back to Jennifer. I heard you'd moved to New York. Things not work out there? He said it like he was talking to a child, and Jennifer's neck heated. Shane took a step forward. She's doing fine in New York. Really? Mark shot a sneer at Shane. And who are you? Jennifer wanted to punch Mark. Or sink into the earth. He really was a supreme jerk. How could she not have seen it when they were dating? Shane put his arm around her. I'm her boyfriend, and I think you'd best be getting on your way. Jennifer might have imagined it, but she thought she saw Shane flex his muscles, which did look intimidating, especially since Mark's arms were about as thick as wet spaghetti noodles. Mark scoffed a little, then tugged on his Barbie doll's arm. Come on. Let's get out of here. The woman just followed him away, her plastic smile in place. Jennifer peered up at Shane. Thanks. What a jerk. I know. I was so dense. I have no idea what I ever saw in him. How embarrassing to realize you were with someone like that. He was a charmer, but she should have seen him as he truly was. A handsome face with rotten insides. Shane took a sip of his hot cocoa. Give yourself a break. You're too hard on yourself. He pointed to the large fir tree the town always decorated. Hey, they're about to turn on the lights. She turned to look and the mayor signaled. The tree came to life with 1,000 twinkle lights, a golden star on top. The crowd made an appropriate noise and Shane chuckled. It looks the same every year. Why does everyone act like it's something new and exciting? Tradition. He smiled down at her. Come on. Let's take a carriage ride. He pointed to the man guiding the horses to the side so the couple could get off. Jennifer melted a bit. She'd always wanted to take a romantic horse-drawn carriage ride through the snowy streets. Maybe now would be a good time to continue their conversation about her moving back to the small town they'd grown up in.
Chapter 11. Shane regretted his rash decision to suggest the carriage ride as soon as they got in and Jennifer snuggled up to him. Her hands were freezing, as always, so he held them between his own and now his stomach was filled with nervous energy. He couldn't stop thinking about the amazing kiss they'd shared just a few short days ago, and how he wanted another taste of her lips. He was such an idiot. He should have learned his lesson years ago. And now Jennifer was going to break his heart again, he knew it. She looked up at him, a smile stretching across her face. This is nice. The horses' hooves clopped along as they traveled through one of the town's quaint neighborhoods, the lit-up houses making the scene picturesque. Yeah, it is, he had to admit. So, about me moving back. Before Shane could think, he pressed his finger up against her lips. Let's not talk about that right now. Touching Jennifer's soft lips had been a mistake, but he couldn't pull away. His finger trailed down to her chin, hooking it and lifting until their lips were so close he could feel the heat from them. He cupped her face, his fingertips exploring the softness of her skin. She closed her eyes, and that's all the invitation he needed. His lips moved over hers with a mind of their own. Kissing Jennifer was a dance he could easily get lost in. Maybe he already was. Her lip balm tasted of strawberries, and a fire ignited in him as she placed her hands on his chest. He wanted this feeling to last forever, but he knew it wouldn't. Someone better would come along and Jennifer would forget about him once more. Someone with more money, or more social status. She was not, and never would be, his. He pulled back, the torture from wanting her too much for him to bear. Jennifer studied him. What's wrong? Nothing. He swallowed, sure she could see everything in his mind written across his face. You're lying. Yep. He was right. She could tell. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. I can't have a relationship with you. She looked down at her hands. What if I move back here? And there it was again. What was he supposed to say to that? Guilt rose in him for lying in the first place. He had to tell her, or he would forever be lying to her. It's not that. Then what is it? I know what you really think of me. There. He'd done it. He'd opened up that can of worms and now he sat there and watched the look on her face, knowing there was no way he could go back now. She pulled her eyebrows together. What are you talking about? He swallowed, trying to find a way to explain himself. Look. You and I aren't really friends anymore. Confusion entered her expression. Sure, we are. When was the last time we talked? Before this Christmas. He could see her mind working, trying to puzzle out what he meant. She backed away from him. I don't know. In high school, I guess. No. Not in high school. His chest ached as he watched her shake her head. She really had no clue. What are you saying? We haven't been friends for a long time, Jennifer. Not since you chose the popular kids over me. I did not. There was no choosing. There was. I heard you, he blurted out. The carriage slowed and he looked out, realizing they were back at the square where they'd started. What? She said as she took the driver's hand and he helped her down. Shane climbed down after her. Thanks, he said, tipping the driver. Then he turned back to Jennifer. He drew in a breath and let it out slowly. Look. I heard you with your friends. They wanted to know why you hung out with me all the time. You shrugged it off. Said I was nobody. Shane tried to make it sound like it wasn't a big deal, but bringing it up also brought up the pain from those words. He flinched and turned away from her. Jennifer's mouth dropped open. Shane. I don't even remember that. He figured that would be the case. But after you started hanging out with the popular kids, you no longer had any use for me. You left me behind. He glanced at her and saw his words had hit their mark. Her face paled and she swallowed. I never meant to. I know. And that was probably the worst part about it. Jennifer hadn't meant to hurt him. She'd just been following after what she wanted, like she always did. She just hadn't wanted him. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets, suddenly cold. Listen, I'd probably better take you home. Jennifer blinked and he saw moisture in her eyes. Shane. It's all right, he said, not letting her finish. He couldn't bear to hear her apologize. What's done is done. It was the past. But we should be realistic about what we are. He chanced a look at her before saying, and we're not friends anymore. She squeezed her eyes shut, a tear traveling down her cheek. Please, let me explain. No need. She was silent on the way home. As he walked her up to her door she sniffed and wiped another tear from her face. He ached to wipe away her tears, but he knew she would never be happy with just a man who worked in a feedlot. A man who couldn't give her what she deserved. On the porch she turned to him. I'm sorry. For everything. Me, too. I wish I could take that day back. Her words made it worse, because in reality, it was not just that one day. It was every day in high school that she ignored him walking down the hall. Every time she turned away to laugh at something one of the jocks said, or every time she'd not even seen him standing near her locker. She had shut him out. And that's what hurt worse than anything. I know, he said. He leaned down and kissed her cheek, then walked home.
Chapter 12. Jennifer buried her head under her pillow, the sunlight unwelcome. She'd spent most of the night crying, unable to sleep. Shane had finally told her the real reason he didn't want to go out with her, and it had hurt her to her core. The worst part about it? He was right. She had said those things to her friends. She'd totally dismissed him to look cool in front of the popular kids. And knowing he'd overheard broke her heart. How could she have done that to him? She felt awful about it, but he wouldn't listen to her apologize. He wanted nothing to do with her, she could see it now. This whole time he'd been trying to distance himself, and she'd been too stupid to notice. Jennifer. Aren't you awake yet? Her mother's voice carried up the stairs. Jennifer moaned and snuggled deeper under the covers. She didn't want to decorate sugar cookies, which was what they always did on Christmas Eve day. A tradition that usually sparked her creativity, but today she just wanted to hide from the world. A knock came on her door. Jennifer? Fine. She had to face her mother eventually. Come in. Her mother opened the door and walked to the bed. She sat on the end. Are you okay? Yes. Come out from under that pillow. I can't hear you. Jennifer slid the pillow off and squinted at the bright sunlight coming in her window. Her mother frowned. What's wrong? Did you break up with Shane? Of course her mother would think it was about a guy. Only this time, it was about a guy. Jennifer tried not to cry, but her eyes betrayed her and teared up.
Yeah.
Sweetie. Her mother patted her arm. I'm sorry. Jennifer waited for the lecture to come. The one where she must have done something wrong, and why couldn't she hold on to a man, but her mother stayed silent. Finally, Jennifer looked over at her. Is that all? Her mother frowned. I could tell you really liked him. Why wasn't her mother upset? Why wasn't she going on and on about her eggs and how she hardly had enough time left? Jennifer sat up and rubbed at her eyes.
Yeah.
I did like him. Her mother clutched at her necklace. Well, maybe we should make him a plate of cookies. Jennifer opened her mouth to protest, but closed it. Maybe her mother was on to something. Maybe she did need to go over there with an excuse to see him. She never got to say her side of things. He wouldn't let her talk at all last night. It wasn't fair. She ran a hand over her hair. You know what, Mom? That's not a bad idea. Her mother smiled and squeezed her hand. Good. You can help me make them. I've got the dough chilled already. Of course you do. It's Christmas Eve day. Jennifer gave her mother a smile. Maybe this day wouldn't be so bad after all. At least she knew she was going to talk to Shane, even if he didn't want to hear it. She had things to say, and he couldn't keep shutting her out.
Shane heard the footsteps on the porch before the knock at the door, and he hated that his heart rate sped up. Why did even the thought of Jennifer do this to him? He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward the front door. He could see her silhouette through the frosted glass, and when he opened the door his stomach dropped. Why did she always have to look like an angel? She shifted her weight nervously. My mother insisted I bring these over, she said, looking down at a plate of Christmas tree cookies. He sighed and opened the screen door. There would be no point in telling her to go back home. Come on in. She handed him the plate and stepped into his entryway. Her gaze bounced around, never landing on him. We should talk. The last thing Shane wanted to do was talk to Jennifer. He hadn't been able to sleep last night. He had thought he was over Jennifer, but he obviously wasn't, and reliving all the past hurt had caused all the pain to resurface. Maybe that's not the best idea. She pointed to the plate of cookies. Are you going to put those in the kitchen? He shrugged. Yeah. I guess so. He walked down the hallway and through the dining area into the kitchen. Jennifer followed after him, wringing her hands. When he set the plate down on the counter, she turned to him. Listen, I just need to get this off my chest. You were right. I did say those things and I did want to be popular in high school. And I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't even know you overheard. I know. He tried not to look into her eyes, but the pull was too strong. But it wasn't just that day. It was every day. I became invisible to you. She blinked, her eyes filling with tears. You're right. I left you behind for the other crowd. I see that now. And if I could do it all over again, you'd do the same thing. She shook her head. No. I wouldn't. I see now how stupid I was. Shane rubbed his temples. No. Not stupid. Shallow, then. He hid a smile. Maybe. Jennifer nodded. I was thoughtless and I hurt you. I took your friendship for granted. And I never should have done that. And now, I don't know if I can repair the damage. She bit her lip. Shane wanted to tell her it was okay, that he would be fine, but the words wouldn't come out. She continued. These last few days with you have been nice. She swallowed. Really nice. It's been good catching up. I've missed this. If he were being honest with himself, he would have to agree with her. He'd missed her more than he would have thought. Just being around her made his day better. He looked forward to getting up in the morning, knowing he would see her. He felt more alive. He was in love. The thought made him balk, and he pressed his lips together. Jennifer must have taken it the wrong way, because she shifted and looked down at her boots. Look, I know you hate me and never want to see me again, but... He took a step toward her and put a finger on her lips, like he'd done in the carriage ride. Hush now. I don't hate you. The words came out soft, almost a whisper. He cupped her face. I could never hate you. She peered up at him, like she didn't quite believe him. The pain behind her eyes broke his heart into a million pieces. He couldn't stand to see her hurting. He lowered his lips until they were almost touching hers. I love you, he whispered. Before she could respond, he kissed her. It started out slow and tentative, but when she wrapped her arms around his waist, he couldn't stand it anymore and he deepened the kiss. He needed her, like a cool drink on a hot day, and he clung to her without reservation. She responded to his kiss, pulling him closer, her hands sliding up his back. He kissed her as he always wanted to. Holding nothing back. And when he pulled back, she peered up at him, her eyes brimming. I'm so sorry for the way I treated you, she whispered. She closed her eyes, and another tear ran down her face. I forgive you, he whispered back, his voice cracking. It wasn't until he said the words that he realized he needed to. He had been holding on to the past for so long, allowing it to hurt him repeatedly. It wasn't healthy. But saying the words gave him a new perspective. He kissed her on the tip of her nose. Does that mean you would go out with me for real? Her eyes held a smile. He ran a finger down her cheek, trying not to smile. I don't know. Depends on what exactly you're asking me to do. I want you to be with me. I don't care what we do. I just want you. He leaned down and kissed the corner of her mouth. You got it.
Epilogue. 1 year later. Jennifer snuggled into Shane as the fireplace crackled. Shane's mother sat on the love seat. The new medicine she'd been on had been helping with her lucidity. Jennifer saw a great improvement in her, and luckily, Shane had been able to keep her at home with him. Maybe we should wait to open presents, Shane said, teasing. He knew she couldn't wait to see what was in the beautifully wrapped gift that had her name on it. She poked him in the side. You're terrible. I don't know, his mother said, playing along. It is only 7 o'clock. There's a marathon of Christmas movies playing. Maybe we should watch one before we open the presents. They had agreed to have Christmas Eve with her mother and Christmas Day at his house. Jennifer had waited for 2 weeks to open the pretty package, and couldn't stand it anymore. Shaking it had not given her any hints, and the way Shane had acted, there was something pretty special inside. She bit the inside of her cheek, trying not to seem too eager. I don't know. I'm getting kind of tired. I'd hate to wait too long. Well, his mother said, a smile hidden in her eyes. I suppose it is dark outside. Maybe we should go ahead and open them. Shane stood and Jennifer immediately missed the warmth of him by her side. All right. I'll pass out the presents. He dug out the gifts from under the tree, passing them out until the last one was left under the tree. The gold one. Let's save this one for last, he said. You are such a stinker. I know if I give it to you, you'll have it open in 2 seconds. Let's open these others, and wait on this for the end. She rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide the smile on her face. All right. They took turns opening gifts. Shane's mother loved the kitchen hand towels Jennifer picked out for her. Shane smiled when he opened the cologne she'd given him. Thank you, he said, as he kissed her temple. When all the gifts had been opened, Jennifer could barely stand to sit still as Shane stood and finally picked up the last one. It was larger than her lap, but didn't weigh anything at all. She was insanely curious. No matter how hard she shook it, no noise came from it. Surely he hadn't wrapped an empty box. Shane held the box, and swallowed before he handed it to her. I've been wanting to give this to you for some time, but I thought it would be best to give it to you today. Jennifer looked up at him. Are you going to sit down? He quickly took his seat beside her.
Yeah.
For some reason, he looked nervous. She peeled back the paper, exposing a plain cardboard box. It was taped shut, so it took a minute to get the flaps open. When she looked inside, all she saw was mounds of tissue paper. Smiling, she dug through the paper, but didn't find anything. She sent Shane a questioning look. Keep digging. She pulled out the tissue paper until she saw the little velvet box sitting on the bottom. Her heart jumped into her throat. A ring? She had not expected that at all. With trembling fingers she pulled the box out. She slowly opened it, her throat so tight she could barely breathe. The box was empty. Shane slipped off the couch, kneeling before her. He held up an engagement ring, the diamond catching the firelight and sparkling. He cleared his throat. Jennifer. You are the reason I get up in the morning. You fill my days with laughter and goodness. You have brought life back into my existence. And I never want you to leave. Will you marry me? His face blurred through her tears. She wiped at her eyes and nodded her head. Yes. Yes. I will marry you. She threw her arms around his neck. Shane's mother snapped a picture. Jennifer snuggled into Shane's chest. I can't believe you wrapped an empty ring box. I've been wanting to ask you to be my wife for the past several months. But it just felt right to wait until Christmas Day. Because you made this my favorite time of year. Jennifer looked into his brown eyes. The kindest eyes she'd ever seen. You are my everything. He leaned closer, his breath on her cheek. I love you, Jennifer. I love you too. She kissed him, warmth enveloping her. She had never loved a man more than she loved Shane. And he'd been right there, next door, her whole life. She would be forever grateful for the moment she slipped on the ice and fell right into his arms. The end. You have been listening to Her Fake Christmas Date by Victorine Lieske. Please click like and subscribe to my channel. Have a wonderful day.